Everyone, welcome to another interview on my YouTube channel. Today I'm just super excited to be joined by Wallace Arthur, who is well, you can explain who you are. Who are you? What do you do?
Okay, okay, Fraser. I'm an emeritus professor of zoology at the National University of Ireland in Galway. I'm an evolutionary biologist by specialization, and I've written about a dozen books, mostly about evolutionary biology on planet Earth. But the most recent one, The Biological Universe, is, of course, about the possibilities of evolution on exoplanets and possibilities of parallels with evolution here on Earth.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of hold up your book here. So your most recent book, The Biological Universe, Life in the Milky Way and Beyond, and I just finished it. I've been reading it for the last couple of weeks, and I went very slowly through it because from that evolutionary perspective, it was like there's a ton of squishy life stuff that I hadn't been focused on, and it was very useful to kind of go through it step by step and and just really understand how incredible and diverse life is here on Earth. So let's talk about that. First, let's just talk about that background of yours about life. So, as a zoologist, what have you been focusing on for your career?
I seem to be almost pathologically attracted towards interface areas
Hmm.
between different branches of science, which is probably what ultimately got me into astrobiology. But I guess I started off my career at the interface between evolution and ecology. So the questions of how the environment molds Darwinian selection, which in turn molds the creatures that are evolving. And I went from there in a complicated pattern to a different interface area, which goes by the strange nickname of evo-devo.
evo-devo.
Now, this is it's almost universally known by this nickname because its full name is evolutionary developmental biology, which is a bit of a mouthful. And so this is about the relationship between the short-term processes that biologists call development, for example, embryogenesis, or in something like a butterfly, metamorphosis, and then the long-term processes that we call evolution. And so, for example, it's well known that human embryos go through a stage where they have gill clefts, structures that look as if they should continue as development progresses and form gills, but they don't. And so this, or not just this single observation, but observations of that kind, are among the strongest forms of evidence for evolution, because, of course, they make no sense whatsoever without it. And it's interesting that Darwin, in his Origin of Species, when he talks about comparative embryology among different animals, he actually says that even if he hadn't come up with natural selection and all the things that he's known best for, he would still have believed in evolution despite that, just because of the information on comparative embryology. And with evo-devo, we've basically turned 19th century comparative embryology into something that's genetically based. I mean, evolutionary developmental biology started about 1980-ish, so it's only as a discipline about 40 years old.
Right, right. As a scientific endeavor, that's fairly young. Um,
Yeah.
uh, so then, so want to sort of break up our conversation into sort of three parts here to sort of match what I think is sort of the larger structures of the book as you wrote it. The first part is to sort of amaze us at the, I guess, the diversity and capabilities of life to fill every single niche in a universe that is largely hostile to it. You talk about just when you think about, people always make this claim that the universe is perfectly tuned for life, but it's sure not. There's so little of the universe that's actually good for life. It's really just this tiny little layer on the Earth, maybe a few dozen kilometers up, maybe 5 kilometers down, and in very specific places. And yet life has really expanded across the entire planet to fill every single niche. From a sort of evolutionary biology perspective, how extreme has life been able to get in conquering some of the nooks and crannies of our planet?
Well, of course, the short answer is very extreme, but I can probably do better than that. So we do talk about animals, and for that matter, other kinds of organisms that live under fairly normal circumstances on Earth as mesophiles, so they're attracted to middling kind of conditions. But we now know of lots and lots of different kinds of extremophiles, as they're called, which are adapted to what really seem to be crazy conditions.
Yeah. You cover some just intense creatures in the book.
Yeah, they're crazy in every direction because they can be very hot, very cold. They can survive incredible acidity or alkalinity. They can survive complete lack of light. The most famous creatures of this kind, at least in the animal world, are these tiny little creatures called tardigrades or water bears, who can be taken down to within a couple of degrees of absolute zero, minus 273 Celsius, at which point, of course, they're in a state of suspended animation, as indeed we would be at minus 270.
Yeah, but they can come back out of it again.
The difference is, yes, that we don't wake up again, and they do. And so they can survive extremes of temperature. And for me, one of the most fascinating things was when they were taken into space on a Russian mission some years ago. And they had this very clever little bit of apparatus called a biopan, where they were able to expose the tardigrades to the outside, to space itself, not the way space dogs, where right. Cosseted inside the capsule.
Yeah, they push them out the airlock.
Yeah, exactly. So, and they were fine. They weren't all fine. Yeah, I mean, the story goes that they survived. Actually, not all of them survived, but plenty of them did survive. And so they can survive the vacuum of space as well as these crazy temperatures. Now, of course, there's also microbes, and maybe there's even more in the microbial world than in the animal world, that more species that can withstand extremes. And what we call hyperthermophiles, the really, really thermophilic ones that like intense heat. There are lots of those in the microbial world, both in the main division of that world that we call the bacteria, but also in the other division that we call the archaea. And it's interesting because they're scattered around the microbial evolutionary tree. So they pop up here and there. And some of them pop up quite close to what we think of as the stem of the tree of life, quite close to the origin of life. And so that has kind of lent weight to the theory that possibly the origin of life on Earth occurred at deep ocean vents.
Right.
Instead of what Charles Darwin called some warm little pond, or Haldane and Oparin called the primordial soup. It's not conclusive, and we still don't actually know in which kind of habitat on Earth life arose, except that it was for sure aquatic. But whether it was hot or warm or cool, we're not sure yet.
And you talk about this necessity for an anaerobic environment as one of the key requirements to get the process started, probably. That that you have an anaerobic environment where you can get the life started, and then you can shift over to creatures that can handle large amounts of oxygen, like the cyanobacteria that were generated the large amounts of oxygen.
Yeah, I mean, you raise an interesting question there, which is whether life could originate in an atmosphere that already was full of oxygen. But that tends not to happen because planetary atmospheres where there isn't life don't tend to have much oxygen. And the early Earth was no exception to that, appears to be general rule. And so, yes, in the early days of evolution on planet Earth, there was very little oxygen, and all the life forms that evolved in the early days were therefore anaerobic life forms of one kind or another, and there were quite a lot of different kinds. And yes, the cyanobacteria were the kind of transitional group, the group that produced probably were the single biggest contributor to what we call the Great Oxygenation Event, which happened in Earth's atmosphere roughly 2 to 2.5 billion years ago. Interestingly, the cyanobacteria today are typically creatures with aerobic metabolism, but at the beginning they must have been otherwise, and so they themselves must have gradually evolved in this respect. But in addition to what happened to them in their own right, it's the fact that they changed the environment for everybody else that was evolving that's really the big thing about these tiny creatures.
And I wonder, I mean, is that an arms race? Like, was that an inevitable outcome that some life form would figure out how to use oxygen in its metabolism, or in which I guess is like sort of like a higher level of energy, and then poison the entire planet as the outcome? Like, it seems like obviously now oxygen, the creatures on Earth largely can handle oxygen and are more energetic than the anaerobic, life forms. My compost pile works better when I let some oxygen in than when it doesn't. Do you think that kind of event was inevitable? Was a great oxidation event just, it had to happen? And therefore, should we see it elsewhere, I guess is where I'm getting at.
Yeah. I think whether something had to happen or not depends very much on the amount of time available. And so one of the things that fascinates me, having read my way from a biology starting point into planetary science, astronomy, astrobiology, is how varied the lifespans of planets are because of how varied the lifespans of their host stars are. And so it looks right now, on the basis of what we know so far, that actually around planets orbiting the biggest, hottest stars probably aren't going to evolve life in the first place because they only last a few million years.
Right, they don't have time.
But if you take planets that have at least an Earth-like span of existence measured in billions of years rather than millions, or beyond that, like the planets that orbit red dwarfs, then I suspect that it is rather an inevitability. Now, of course, that's a personal view. What's inevitable is a hard thing to call. But one way of looking at it is in terms of what are the sources of energy for life forms? And I don't mean just on Earth, but on planetary surfaces in general. And in terms of planets in the habitable zones, then generally speaking, the most abundant form of energy is light, sunlight. There is chemical energy to be had. And of course, once there are other organisms, you can eat them, but ultimately they have to get their energy from somewhere. So life might well ordinarily start out in the form of some chemosynthesizing microbes, just making use of whatever chemical energy is at hand. But given the abundance, the superabundance, if you like, of sunlight, then I imagine that in many biospheres on many planets, forms will evolve somewhere in the tree of life that are able to harness this incredible supply of light energy. Even then, though, there's kind of an interesting distinction with regard to how you do that, because it's less well known, I think, that there are forms of photosynthesis that don't actually produce oxygen. So
really,
yeah,
okay.
So we talk about oxygenic photosynthesis, the type that does produce oxygen, and anoxygenic photosynthesis, the type that doesn't. And in different groups of microbes, right now on Earth, you have some doing one and some doing the other. So the cyanobacteria are pretty well known as conducting the oxygenic form of photosynthesis. But then there are these fascinating sulfur bacteria which conduct the other kind of photosynthesis. And it's really beautifully parallel in terms of the substances that are involved. So instead of H2O in oxygenic photosynthesis, where you end up producing O2, you use H2S instead, hydrogen sulfide, and then instead of producing oxygen, you produce sulfur. And so that kind of photosynthesis may also quite often evolve given the superabundance of light energy on planetary surfaces, but that's not going to do the same job for the rest of the biosphere as oxygenic photosynthesis is. And so the cyanobacteria really were key rather than other groups of microorganisms conducting different kinds of photosynthesis that didn't produce oxygen.
So there is a non-oxygen producing method of harnessing sunlight as your method, but you're not going to create the same kind of environment that is beneficial to other life forms. So I guess I kind of got to go back to my original question, which is, would that outcompete the oxygen producing ones? Or in the end, is some version of a cyanobacteria going to crack this problem and then flood the planet with oxygen? Like, you talk about like convergent evolution. You talk about various ideas that have been discovered multiple times by various species. And you think about things like, and you talked about trees and how trees are one example of get tall, shade your neighbors, get the sun. But there's also different kinds of ferns and club mosses and things like this idea of getting tall, grabbing more sun has been thought of multiple times. And so you would expect to see anywhere you go, if the major source of energy is light, you're going to see trees. Now, they're not going to be trees as we necessarily understand them, but they're going to be performing the same function. And so based on what we see of life doing here on Earth, broad strokes, what can we expect to see life doing on other worlds?
Yeah, good question. And of course, we have to remember that there are probably very many other worlds, and so the answer to your question might differ between one of them and another. But I'm
sorry. I just want to just sort of fine tune this question
ahead.
just before you took. Like I think the sense that I really got was that when astrobiologists look out into the universe, we have a sample set of one. We say we have only one example of a planet in this universe that has life. But that's not exactly true. We have an example of life on Earth accomplishing the same outcome multiple times in the same conditions. And so literally you have an Earth-sized world orbiting a sun-like star, and many life forms have figured out how to tree. And that feels like a hint at what the rest of the universe might hold in store for us.
Yes, and one feature of the book is that I try to address a series of hypotheses and make them central in the story that I tell. And one of those is called the parallel places hypothesis, as you will probably remember.
Yep.
And for me, looking at the fascinating array of exoplanets that we've discovered as a biologist, and then concentrating on the ones that are, rocky planets in the habitable zone, forgetting about things like hot Jupiters, which don't look like they're good homes for life. But it seems to me that you don't have to make too many assumptions to rapidly get to a place where you think a lot of the environmental features are going to be the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if the environmental features are the same, and we believe that Darwinian evolution is something that applies across the universe, wherever you find life, and I do firmly, personally believe that, then parallel natural selection operating on the basis of parallel environments is going to produce a parallel array of organisms. Now, not of course to the level of fine detail where the intelligent life forms on other planets look like us but with pointy ears. I'm thinking of my favorite alien, Mr. Spock, of course. Sure. But nevertheless, in terms of the broad brush painting of the living world as evolution does it on other planets, I strongly suspect it's going to take, in most cases, shall we say, rather similar paths that life has taken on Earth. So you can start, for example, with gravity. Planets cannot escape having gravity. It's just got to be there. It is there. It varies a little bit in the extent, but if you're a small rocky planet in a habitable zone, you're going to have gravity like Earth's, a bit less, a bit more. If you're in the habitable zone, so there's liquid water there, and there's almost certainly a water cycle, a bit similar to Earth, because the temperature is not going to be absolutely constant, and so you're going to have some evaporation and condensation and so on. We haven't yet discovered a planet, talking now in terms of topography, we haven't yet discovered a planet that's like a spherical equivalent of a bowling green, so there's no topography.
Right,
so
you talked about that, yeah.
There are always hills and mountains and valleys and plains. And so if you combine that with gravity and with a water cycle, that means you're going to have streams and rivers and lakes and oceans. It's kind of hard to get away from that. And if you have all those things, it means you have both terrestrial habitats and freshwater and marine habitats. And if you're going to be a large organism, especially on land as opposed to in the ocean, then you actually need some form of support against gravity, which is why all the largest organisms on Earth, both plants and animals, have got things like wood or bones. So I don't know whether on some exoplanet somewhere in the habitable zone, we're going to get the evolution of wood or bones, but I think we're going to get the evolution of something that does the same job.
And once again, you talk about life coming up with that solution multiple times, that the insects have their exoskeletons, trees have their trunks, animals have bones. So time and time again, you see the same versions of solutions being developed for the problem of gravity, the problem of you live in liquid, the problem of you've got a thick atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the problem of you need to get more sunlight than your neighbors.
Yeah.
And so again, I really feel strongly that almost everything that we need to know about what life can come up with in a physical universe is being demonstrated to us ad infinitum here on planet Earth. That convergent evolution tells us that in fact we've seen eyes come up 50 times here on Earth, therefore that we actually have 50 examples of eyes, not one.
I love this view because it's the opposite of the pessimistic sample size of one view.
Wait for my pessimism. We'll get deep into my pessimism.
Okay, we'll get to your pessimism.
Yeah.
But while we're with optimism, let's stay optimistic for a bit. And if you go to the optimistic extreme, then what you can say is that you have this incredibly complex tree of life on this planet, and it's got lots of growing tips, growing twigs, if you like. And in a way, each of those is making its way quasi-independently into the future and making its own decisions. It's only, of course, quasi because everything's connected with everything else. But when you find the same things, the same solutions hit upon by lots of different lineages, often separated by millions of years from each other, coming from very different directions, and yet finding those same solutions, I think that's very telling about the way in which natural selection works and the way in which it can actually produce the same results, regardless of whether the starting material, in terms of the particular lineage that it's operating on, is different.
Yeah, yeah. So in the I guess in the middle part, so you set up this case for life and just like all the different diversity of life, and then in the second part of the book, you talk more about sort of extending these ideas and saying, okay, now let's take a look at how habitable the universe seems to be. And again, you make the case that it seems like there's a lot of places that are great for life. Many other sun-like stars, many other planets. There's tons of planets. You sort of run through the Drake equation, and you have a very rosy outlook on the number of places out there that probably have life. You estimate about 1 billion worlds could have
microbial life.
Yeah, could have microbial life.
Yeah.
You know,
I think there's a big difference. Sorry.
Oh, out of the 100 to 400 billion stars in the Milky Way, you know, I think that's, you know, I mean, it's all just guessing at this point. But, you know, it seems like if life arises quickly and can exploit any environment, that almost feels like a vast underestimation.
It may well be. And I actually adopt the principle of trying to give conservative estimates when I approach the questions of the number of instances of different kinds of life, because obviously you can, in astrobiology, you can rapidly get into what you might call unbridled speculation and run away with yourself and lots of crazy ideas. And especially if you're an optimist, as I am, about extraterrestrial life. So I think it's actually helpful to always take estimates at the lower bound of any brackets that you get. And I personally would think that there are probably more than 1 billion planets with microbial life in the galaxy. The interesting thing, you mentioned the Drake equation. The interesting thing to me, you know, coming into this as a biologist and coming into it a long time after Frank Drake came up with this equation back in around about 1960. Well, two things really. One is that some of the parameters in the equation we now can estimate, as you know, quite well compared with what could be done in 1960. So the probability of a planet, of planets in general, orbiting a sun, well, it's probably nearly 100%. And the number of Earth-like planets per star, well, it may well be something like 1 in 100. It's probably not less than 1 in 1,000 anyhow. I mean, orders of magnitude are all you can do here, but, you know. And then the other side of the Drake equation is that if you, as a biologist, are interested in all sorts of life, not just intelligent life, then a lot of the hardest parameters just drop out of the equation because they relate to the unknowns about things like how long intelligent life lasts before it destroys itself. With microbes, we know they've been around on Earth for 4 billion years. And so the lifespan parameter is a lot easier to grapple with than it is for intelligent life, where we really don't know whether once you get to the radio level of intelligence, what we know is that you last at least a century. But it might not be much more than that.
I mean, again, seeing how quickly life found the way here on Earth, like it just seems like the second life could arrive on Earth, could begin happening on Earth, it did. And so I think we are definitely back to a sample size of 1 in this situation, but yet it seems funny, weird that it started so quickly. And that feels like it's an indication, at least, that if life was able to start so quickly, then life should be starting quickly in other places as well. That it seems almost, I mean, I definitely don't want to say inevitable, but it really seems like it trends towards it happening rapidly. Therefore, it should be everywhere.
I think I would agree with that.
Okay.
As long as we remember that when you say life began very quickly after the Earth was born, we need to remember that quickly maybe within the first 500 million years. So, the Earth is roughly 4.6 billion years old. Life is approximately 4 billion years old, with a wobble of perhaps plus or minus 0.3 on that. And so, yes, it was very quickly in the grand scheme of things, but looked at another way, 500 million years is 500 million years, which is almost the entire history or known history of the animal kingdom. So we have to be a little bit careful when we say quickly. But I agree with you that in the grand scheme of things, that is quickly. And to me, that also suggests the conclusion that perhaps it's close to the inevitable end of things rather than close to the vanishingly improbable end.
Right. So you, but I mean, like you have, I mean, yeah, it's whatever, 500 million years after the formation of the Earth, but how much of the Earth, how much of that early time of the Earth was it a ball of molten rock? How much of it was it being constantly bombarded by planetesimals that were continuing to liquefy the surface and make it. So if you take that 500 million years, how much of that was just inhospitable by any measure?
Probably less than half of it.
Okay, great. So now we're down to 250 million years. You got 250
Yeah.
million years,
Yeah.
really, that life could exist. And even that was probably, you got going and then you got hit by an asteroid, and then you got going and you got hit by an asteroid. Like, can we narrow it? But you would comfortably say 250 million years of after the Earth was habitable, life formed. And at the same time, aren't we still finding examples of older life? Like, do you think that if you could do a comprehensive search of every fossil on Earth, could you get closer to that 250 million years?
Probably via fossils, no. But simply because when you're right back at the beginning of the evolution of life on Earth, and you're dealing with tiny protocellular creatures, don't even have much of a cell wall, those things are simply not going to fossilize. And so
Right.
I do suspect that life originated much earlier than we have the earliest evidence for.
Yeah.
And so I think in a sense, this reinforces your point that it got going
Right.
really quite soon after it could.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like, I know in my reporting, they find another, and I forget the name. I'm sure you know the names of them. In Australia, they find another example of a bacterial colony, the limestone produced by a bacterial colony or whatever it is, right?
Maybe stromatolites.
Stromatolites, that's it, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
They find stromatolites. They find evidence that there was bacteria going, and it feels like it's sort of like it's approaching some asymptotic endpoint where you're like, you keep finding life a little bit farther and a little bit farther. Anyway, so what I'm saying is it really does feel, I think we can narrow both sides of that non-life time and really shrink it and shrink it and shrink it. So you in the book disagree with the rare earth hypothesis. So you say that, in rare earth, they say bacterial life is going to probably be everywhere, but complex life, that jump from single cellular to multicellular organisms, is probably really likely as opposed to unlikely. Defend that.
Okay. Yeah, I will. I'll take pleasure in defending it. I do strongly disagree with the rare earth hypothesis. I very much enjoyed reading the
I
rare
love the
earth
book. Yeah.
book. It's a great book, but I happen to think they're what can I say? Wrong. Okay, I think they're wrong. I think they're very wrong. It's interesting. I mean, I started reading that book, and I thought, given that they have complex life in the book's subtitle, I thought, well, what on earth do they mean by complex life? They seem happy. They draw this very definite line between what they call simple life and complex life. Where do they draw the line, and what do they mean when they say complex life? Um, Eventually, I found it, and they say animals and higher plants. Now, we've long since stopped thinking of life as a scala naturae, if you like, a kind of ladder of progress. And so, what's a higher plant and what's a lower plant? I'm really not sure. I tried looking up various plant groups in the index before I then started through the book as itself, and neither the index nor the book told me anything about any plants except algae, which they deemed to be lower plants. So let's say, since what they were saying was a bit woolly in relation to the plant kingdom, let's stick with animals, where they were clear, and they said, okay, we think all animal life is complex life. One assumes that means including sponges and jellyfish and flatworms and all these things that some people would call lower animals. So, okay, they say this kind of life is vanishingly rare, but microbial life is very common. There are several ways you can approach a counter-argument. And I think the one I like the best is to think in terms of the relative lifespans on Earth of the microbial type of life and the animal type of life. And so microbial life has been here, as we've just been discussing, for at least 4 billion years, maybe a little bit longer. The time span for animal life has proved a bit harder to pin down because there was this enigmatic event that I'm sure you're aware of called the Cambrian explosion of animal life, which took place a little bit over 500 million years ago, or 500 million years ago. There were animals before that, but not very many different types. And there were some creatures, the so-called Ediacaran biota, which nobody's quite sure even if they were animals or not. But what we can say about animal life is that it's definitely been on Earth for more than 500 million years and less than 1 billion years.
Right.
So compared with microbial life, for example, bacteria, it's been around for maybe a quarter of that time, or maybe only an eighth of that time. Now, if things go in parallel, roughly speaking, on other planets, for example, we don't expect any evolutionary system anywhere to start off with multicells and then produce unicells from them. That just doesn't seem to make sense. So it'll go the same way. Then it may take an equally long period of time before the unicells are equipped to build multicellular bodies. But unless the process is sort of hopelessly slower than it was on Earth, then ballpark, what we might expect is if we take 1,000 planets that have got microbial life, and they're at a whole different range of stages in their evolutionary histories, maybe about a quarter of them, or if you're pessimistic, maybe about an eighth of them, have got animals. So I don't really see why they're so pessimistic and want to draw such a clean line of separation between microbes, simple life on the one hand, and animals and other complex forms of life on the other.
It feels to me like a no true Scotsman fallacy is the way I sort of describe it, which is like you see an ant colony where you've got 1 million ants working together in a very complicated pattern. And you say, well, they're just ants. That's not intelligent behavior. But they're actually doing something incredibly intelligent. It's like a single organism that is keeping its eye on every food source in an entire region, and bringing it back to the nest, and in a way that no one organism could ever do. You look at various kinds of fungi or other kinds of bacterial mats that are working in ways, slime molds. Like there are ways that single cellular organisms can work together in ways that are surprising. And I would anticipate that as we look out, going back to that idea of like trees are going to tree, that I think you're going to find that life is going to figure out how to accomplish the more complicated behavior through various mechanisms. And the one that we seem to have here on Earth is animals. But that's where I don't think we necessarily need to describe it as an animal in the same way. Am I making any sense? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, you're making lots of sense
Okay.
as usual.
Okay. So it's just like it feels to me like you kind of like you look at it and you say, but that's, there's nothing interesting happening on that world because it never figured out animals. And yet you see these, bacteria have clumped together into a floating object, and they are somehow flying through the atmosphere and harvesting the sunlight better than anything else. Imagine if a blob of cyanobacteria lifted out of the ocean and floated around in the atmosphere. That would be interesting. And yet you don't have to have multicellular organism to do it. And so it's kind of like, it's that idea. Again, life finds a way. And I think for us to say, well, that's single cellular, sure, that's common. Animals, rare. Therefore, complicated life, rare. And I think that is a mistake to make that distinction.
I completely agree with you. And I think it's also a mistake to draw a straightforward line between what we think of as unicellular life forms and multicellular ones, because there's lots of fuzziness at that border. One of the most fascinating things about evolution on planet Earth, and one of the things that I think it's hardest to generalize about when you think about what's happening on exoplanets elsewhere, is this strange fact that on Earth, we seemed to need to make, in evolutionary terms, a more complicated cell, the so-called eukaryotic cell, before we could make things like animals and plants and fungi, the things that have big multicellular bodies. Whether that's true elsewhere is an open question, I think. But even here on Earth, if you take the simpler cells, the prokaryotic cells of creatures like bacteria and archaea, then if you scan across those two realms, the bacterial and the archaeal realms, with an eye particularly on questions about multicellularity, what you find is that there are all sorts of exceptions to the sort of rule, if you can even call it that prokaryotic means unicellular. And so, well, to take the cyanobacteria, they of course build these enormous structures called stromatolites, which are in some cases more than a meter tall.
They're making a tree.
Layers. Well, I suppose it's a sort of a mutant tree, you could say. Yeah.
Right.
Layers and layers of these cells, and that is a kind of a big body in itself, if you want to look at it in that way. There's also a group, perhaps less well known, called the myxobacteria, which makes strange structures that also, in fact, they look even more like little trees. In fact, if you Google body form in myxobacteria, then you find some beautiful looking structures. They almost conjure up fractals and all sorts of patterns in your mind. And they clearly make structures which defy the neat label unicellular.
Right.
And so I think, to think of this tremendously firm line between simple and unicellular and prokaryotic on the one hand, and then all the complex things on the other hand, is a mistake. And I firmly believe that the authors of Rare Earth made that mistake, and I do argue quite strongly against
Yeah.
that.
All right. You know, the rest of the book, the sort of the final part of the book is you talk about the search and the techniques and the technologies to be able to look for this kind of life and how difficult it's actually going to be. And, my audience is very familiar. This is, we talk about this quite a bit, so I'll shorten this. Now, do you feel like you've been set up sort of during this conversation? Do you feel like you've been strongmanned enough? Because now I want to talk about why, and I guess I feel like I need to sort of set this up a little bit, which is like life, by all reckoning, life should be everywhere. And I think we can make that, we don't need to make that distinguishing point between single cellular life and multicellular life. There should just be life in many, many places. And we haven't even talked about the places that are not Earth-like, the water worlds, ocean worlds, that there could be chemical synthesis under ice, etc. And we haven't talked about panspermia and the idea that life could be getting from world to world. But just sort of this, as Enrico Fermi said, life should be everywhere. So where is it? How do you square that circle where, on the one hand, every part of your research tells you that life is everywhere, and yet, to the best of our ability, we don't find it? And I want to sort of shorten the just the conversation about the fact that we haven't really looked, because it's not about, like, all I need to do to find life here on Earth is to just take a glass, dip it into any water anywhere, and I'll find life. So it's not about life. It's not me finding life in every nook and cranny of planet Earth. It's about life finding its way to every single nook and cranny of the Milky Way. And that's not what we see. Why not?
Sure. Well, I think in relation to the Fermi paradox, for me, the huge difference is between the commonness of life in general, or at least what I would imagine is the commonness of life in general, and the relative rarity of intelligent life. And this goes hand in hand with how we detect life. So in relation to the Fermi paradox, you can think in terms of receipt of radio messages, or replies to our radio messages, or you can think of incoming spacecraft, et cetera. But if you take an evolutionary process that hasn't yet produced intelligent life, for example, if you just think of Earth, and you don't have to think of Earth a long time ago, you can think of Earth simply in Darwin's day, less than 2 centuries ago, when there were no radio transmissions, there was not even a hint of a spacecraft. There was no way we could communicate with anybody out there. So if you take Earth any time from 4.6 billion years in the past up to, let's say, 1859, the year of publication of The Origin of Species, that's pretty much all of your 4.6 billion years right there. I mean, there's not much after that. We, as a planet, would have been entirely invisible to aliens who are listening for radio broadcasts from us, or waiting for visits from spacecraft that have been sent from Earth. So if you take planets that have an evolutionary process that works at the same ballpark speed as ours does, and of course there's another if right there, but supposing that's the case, and you take planets that are up to about 4.5 billion years old, then those are all going to be silent from the perspective of the Fermi paradox. Now, then the difficult thing is, I mean, it's easy to look into the evolutionary past, and it's a lot harder to look into the evolutionary future. And what we don't know is how long we, as a species who describe ourselves as intelligent, some ways merited and some ways not, how long are we going to last as a civilization that broadcasts radio waves and can construct spacecraft?
Yeah.
Now, you can construct a reasonable hypothesis that says we'll be gone within a millennium for various reasons, planetary destruction, nuclear war, you name it. Or you can say, well, actually, we're pretty good survival machines with all our technology and so on. We seem to be in the middle of a pandemic and kind of surviving it for the most part. And maybe instead of lasting for a millennium, we'll last for 1,000,000 years. And we have no idea which of those is true, or whether it could even be 1 billion years, though no species has ever lasted for 1 billion years, so that seems unlikely.
Right.
So if intelligent life forms typically don't last very long and are, if you like, a victim of their own technology, then at any one time, like the present, the number of them existing in the Milky Way might be very small. Right. And I think that might be a big part of the answer to the Fermi paradox. It's not a particularly, we're back to optimism versus pessimism here. It's not a particularly optimistic one, but I think there might be some truth in it.
Well, I think, where we stand currently as humanity and sort of the rise of 3D printing and spacefaringness, I would say we're within 100 years of being able to create self-replicating robot probes. We send a spacecraft to an asteroid, it dismantles the asteroid, builds a copy of itself, and then sends one to another asteroid, and then they build more of these things. I would say we're within 1,000 years of being able to have these robot factories start going off to other star systems, conservatively. If you just take the doubling of energy at the rate that it is, and I think the prediction is about 700, in about 700 years, it'll be relatively inexpensive for us to afford to send spacecraft to other star systems. So in that 1,000-year window that you gave us, we should be able to start the germ, start seeding the entire Milky Way with literally self-replicating robot probes that will go to every single star system in the entire Milky Way in a few million years. And the fact that intelligent civilizations could have arisen in the Milky Way billions of years before even the Earth formed, we would anticipate that somewhere, someone did that, anywhere, ever. And so I sort of back to that analogy. And this is the part that for me just feels so, where I just, I'm so enthusiastic about the possibilities for life everywhere. And yet as we think about what the future holds for us, why, apart from, I guess, a newly discovered monolith in Utah, I don't know if you've heard about this. Someone put some art installation in Utah, pretty much right where they filmed 2001. So there's actually a monolith.
The obelisk,
Utah. Right? Yeah. Why are there not monoliths all over the solar system as evidence of the past alien intelligences that went through all that process, got the life, got complicated, got technology, and spread that stuff around? We, to the best of our ability, the best that we have explored, we haven't found it a single time. And so for me, and my audience is very familiar with this, it just drives me bananas. Because life should be everywhere, and yet we see no evidence whatsoever of it making its way to us. And that's the thing. And the analogy that I always use is, you have a sandwich, you take a drop of mold, you put it anywhere on the sandwich, you come back a week later, and the whole sandwich is mold. And doesn't matter where it started, wherever you look, you've got mold. And
that's for sure.
and that's our future.
Well, for the first time, Fraser, in this interview, you've said something that I don't agree with. So that's good, because it's always very healthy to disagree.
Yeah.
So I go with you part of the way, but we part company, and let me tell you where. So with regard to the robotic spacecraft out there in the asteroid belt doing whatever they're doing, I have no real problem with that. I think even the timescale that you suggest for it may be absolutely spot on. So, yeah, I go with you that far. I think where we part company is in relation to what happens between solar systems, or between, if we have this odd question, does solar system just mean our system, or do we talk about other solar systems, or should we call them planetary systems? But whatever, let's call them planetary systems. So in terms of planetary systems, in my opinion, there's a reasonable chance that intelligent life forms which get to the stage of a spacefaring technology may be somewhat more restricted than you're suggesting to their own system.
Right.
That's sad. I mean, I'm fascinated by the plans of Breakthrough Starshot to send these little nanocraft to Proxima b. But in terms of normal size spacecraft, trying to actually get them to go to another planetary system, as opposed to going to the farther reaches of your own system, in our case, like New Horizons, getting to Pluto, for example, I'm not so sure that I buy the ease of that kind of travel.
Right.
Even with nanocraft, the idea is, of course, that it would take decades, and that's traveling at a fair fraction of the speed of light, which is way, way, way beyond what we can achieve now. And ultimately, you get to Einstein's speed limit, even if you do increase your technology. So I think there's a concern there.
You did mention Oumuamua in your book.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's the counter I always have is, literally rocks have figured this out.
Well, Oumuamua is probably the most fascinating visitor we have ever had. I just think Oumuamua is fascinating. It just seems so bizarre that we have an asteroid belt and a Kuiper belt, and they're full of objects of all kinds of weird shapes, like mutant potatoes or whatever. They're all rather irregular, but almost none of them are long and thin. And so here comes our interstellar visitor, and it's about 10 times as long as it is wide. And that's just very, very weird.
It really is. But what a wonderful discovery that the first interstellar object that we're able to find has such a bizarre feature, and just leads to all kinds of other really interesting research into what could have caused that. And I've heard some really great ideas about what could lead to it having that kind of a structure. But that's a whole other conversation. Well, I think we can sort of wrap up the conversation at this point. I knew I couldn't convince you, but I wanted to at least bring you partway into the deep unease and existential, concern that I have. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it. The book is The Biological Universe. I really enjoyed it, especially for getting essentially an astrobiologist telling you everything you need to know about life. And that part was very useful to me, and I really enjoyed it. If people want to find out more about what you're working on, where can they go? Where can they find you?
Well, they could go to my page on Amazon. They could go to my Wikipedia page, or they could go to my university website, but I have to tell you that it's slightly out of date.
No problem. Go to the Amazon page and then buy the. But I'll put a link to all of those in the show notes. But go to the Amazon page and buy a copy of the book, because it was absolutely enjoyable, and like I said, I think I learned so much just about life and how it works, and that's the part that I always sort of gloss over when I'm looking at various astrobiology papers, which is clearly counterproductive. So thank you for giving me an education in this.
Well, I'm delighted that you enjoyed the book, Fraser. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if you do find life, would you let us know?
Sure.
All right.
You'll be the first to know,
Oh,
Fraser. You
perfect.
will.
Thank you, Wallace. Take care.
Okay, cheers.